Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet, which is, among other things, still wrapped in a pandemic. Doesn't feel that way sometimes. It's a human heated planet, which is something I've been writing about for 35 years, and my guests know a huge amount about as well. It's a planet now riven by violence and disruption to energy markets and food prices through the nearly year-long invasion of Ukraine by Vladimir Putin. I wrote a year ago about what do you do when a superpower goes rogue, and that's still an open question. And it's a planet wrapped in there's information pollution as well. And the goal of this weekly, pretty much broadcast, it used to be like several times a week, is to try to cut through misinformation and distraction and get us to push forward toward impact on some of the tough, important issues that we face. And if you're on the West Coast of the United States, you know you're dealing with an epic series, a barrage of atmospheric rivers. It's a term that's less familiar than hurricane. You know, we have on the East Coast hurricane season, and in the Pacific, typhoons and cyclones in the Indian Ocean. And this phenomenon goes back way beyond 1998 when the term was first used in the scientific literature. It's essentially the ocean is a giant heat engine. It's full of moisture. You get heat and moisture together, you get evaporation, you put it on a spinning planet, and you get astonishing, powerful systems occasionally emerging that come to shore. And as everyone here was active on social media these last few days, weeks, trying to convey to people what's going on, what to do about it. I have some wonderful guests here today, one by phone, who you'll only hear from, but I'll show you her face in a minute. And we'll get to Deirdre. Erica, I always forget, is it geese or guys? I'm sorry. Guys. It should be so easy for me to remember that. Erica Guys, who is a great journalist who has a book that couldn't be more timely called The Water Always Wins. Water Always Wins. I loved I love your website, Slow Water. In other words, slow things down, and you can handle this stuff. And Dustin Mulvaney, who's a professor in environmental studies at San Jose State University, who's been, again, in the middle of things, very active on Twitter and elsewhere, posting videos that we'll look at in a minute from as the rivers, the on-land rivers, the terrestrial rivers, are trying to handle the flow from these atmospheric rivers. And California has so much built surface that creates problems. And there's the next generation in the room as well. Oh, and let me make sure I've got also Deirdre.
That's a third generation.
Third? Oh, is that a cat? Oh,
it is.
I was just in a house here in Maine with a cat that sounded exactly like a human being. There we go. Deirdre Desjardins is here as well, and she's an independent scholar in California focused on water sanity. And maybe we'll start with Dustin. So how do you deal with the whiplash effect here? I wrote about this like a decade ago in the New York Times when there was another sort of flip from drought to flood. A lot of what the science says right now is that, most floods in California break through atmospheric rivers. So it's a normal part of the system. We'll talk about the history of them. But on the ground, even psychically, how do you deal with that year by year, day by day?
Well, obviously, I'm a little bit of a weather nerd. I follow the weather very closely and have been following kind of the changes and how our county is preparing for natural disasters. I knew I was moving into an area that had natural disasters, the 1989 earthquake in Santa Cruz. And so I think that my way of dealing with it is a little different than the public, because I don't get the same whiplash. Of course, I experienced the whiplash, but I see the planners and the people who are responding or preparing to respond to disasters. They've been working on a lot of these issues. And so while we're in the middle of a drought, there are people thinking about the flood. And while we're in the middle of a flood, there are people thinking about the next wildfire or how to think about managing the next water resource. So me personally, I feel a little more confident in the officials that are working on these particular issues and how they're preparing for them. But when it happens, it's still pretty dramatic. So even as I say that, the actual experience of suddenly it's raining for 30 days in a row almost, after having very dry years for, well, we've had a couple of wet years in the middle, but it's like 12 years or so of pretty mostly dry seasons in California, which for me as a mushroom forager has been very, very troubling. So I was pretty excited when the first rains came, but now all the mushrooms are all kind of mashed by all the rest of the rain after it piles up.
So Deirdre, I think you're on back on the phone now. So we want to show what happened last night when the thunderstorms came through. And actually, maybe I'd ask you how unusual it is to have thunderstorms this time of year. I know thunderstorms have been involved with some of the fires and the like. So Deirdre, if you can hear me right now, just describe where you are and what you do a little bit, and then we could get to what happened last night.
I am. I've been advocating on climate adaptation in the California water sector for 12 years. I have a background in researching chaos theory and tipping points and complex systems theory. I did research in several decades ago at Los Alamos Lab and the Santa Fe Institute for Complex Systems. Mm-hmm. And I'm seeing kinds of nonlinear changes and nonlinear acceleration that are very reminiscent of the research that I did. So it's been very interesting, and I read all of the climate impact research and advocate for facing inconvenient truths. And there's enormous forces in California, as I think everywhere, to not really face those truths and to just keep doing what we're doing.
Yeah, we'll talk about that pattern. Erica's book is about breaking that pattern. Erica, we'll get to you in a second. I just wanted to get back to this, your direct experience last night. So Deirdre, tell people where you live and just how you saw all this coming, but what happened last night?
So we bought, back in 2021, we bought a house near the summit of a mountain in the Santa Cruz Mountains. And it's a beautiful house. It's kind of like living in a fire lookout, except, it's a whole house and we have a gorgeous view of the valley. But we do get huge winds up here. And last night, a microcell hit around 2 a.m. and I heard this amazingly loud noises, and it was raining heavy redwood branches on our roof.
Wow.
And our house, and the wind picked up our patio furniture and threw it across our deck. So it was, we've had storms. I've lived in the Santa Cruz Mountains since 1997. And so I'm used to storms, but this was unusually strong. And I was also living in it reminded me some of living in Felton when there was the CZU August Lightning Complex fire, and a small tornado hit and broke apart this tree, and there was this incredibly loud cracking noise. So it reminded me of that, and the storms, the ferocity of the wind I have not experienced before.
Incredible.
In California, yeah.
I'm just going to show, I'm showing I love the website windy.com, which is the global map of wind patterns and forecasts. And it's showing, of course, the troubling thing for California and Oregon to a certain extent, is you're in the middle of a parade of these systems.
Yeah.
Through at least the next 10 to 15 days, more coming, including, this is going forward. If people look down at the bottom of the screen here, this is Wednesday. And you can see that fire hose sweeping right through. There's San Jose. And then another one is coming and another one is coming. So Erica, your book came out last year, maybe mid-year.
Yep, in June.
And I had you on talking about Hurricane Ida, the remains of which created horrific flash flooding. That was before your book came out, in New York, the New York area. And now you have this. I mentioned slow water, or the idea of slowing things down. And when you think about the normalcy of this kind of condition and climate change, as I'll show in a minute, there's some science pointing to the idea that it'll get more intense. There'll be more intense systems at the very least because of more atmospheric water vapor. What do you tell people? What's the key point of what chapter in your book is most relevant in thinking about a place that has this unbelievable whiplash from drought to superflood? And of course, what we're seeing now is a pale shadow of what can be.
Yeah, it's not that uncommon for places around the world to have long dry seasons naturally. A couple of the places in my book that I visited in addition to California are Peru and India, and the east coast of South India and the Andes Mountains in Peru also have long dry seasons. And something that a lot of people don't think about is that drought and flood are flip sides of the same issue. And one of the key points I make in my book is that it's not just climate change that's causing these disasters. A lot of it has to do with our development choices, and that is urban sprawl, industrial agriculture, and the very engineering, concrete intensive way that we attempt to control water. And, we've interfered with the water cycle to a really dramatic extent. And I don't think many people realize the cumulative impact that we've had around the world. We've actually drained or filled in 87% of the world's wetlands. We've intervened with dams and diversions on 2/3 of the world's big rivers. And the area of pavement that our cities cover has doubled just since 1992. So the issue with all of these things is that we are preventing water from accessing its natural slow phases in wetlands, floodplains, forests, and mountain meadows, where the water has a chance to move underground. And that captures the local rain that falls so that it's available, more of it's available locally for dry periods. It absorbs floods. There's also important other co-benefits like carbon storage, habitat for other critters. And so, yeah, basically the slow water practitioners in my book are all looking for ways to give water some more of its land area back so it can slow. And, typically this is distributed. So lots of small projects throughout a watershed.
Yeah, I created a visual, I might be able to pull it up, a while back called Build Forward Spongier. As opposed to Build Back Better. The idea of Build Back Better I do not like, because it's kind of restoring what was. And I think everyone here, Dustin, I know you think about path dependency and how to break it.
Yeah, I was going to add too, I was thinking about that slow water concept a bit when the bomb cyclone hit California a couple of days ago, which didn't bring a ton of rain to our area, but brought just tremendous wave action. What I was watching was Westcliff Drive is a drive in Santa Cruz that has a very nice view. It's literally right on the coastal bluff there. And I was watching waves crash onto the road, all funnel down to a low point in the road and literally carving away the pylons that were holding a bridge in place. Like a really small bridge. I was thinking, we got to slow that water down somehow. We got to get rid of that pavement. That's really I mean, because water really carves once it starts rolling fast like that on those paved surfaces. So,
and that's the thing, like a natural ecosystem, like a tidal marsh, for example, has a lot of complexity and a lot of roughness, as hydrologists call it. And that all works to kind of naturally slow water and buffer human habitat from these kinds of impacts.
yeah.
Yeah, and I'm also showing another aspect of the California geology, just the nature of the state. It's a state where the rock is in motion on every time scale, right? You've got giant plates going under each other. You have grinding, then you have human construction, and you see that this was a California Highway Patrol video yesterday near Fresno showing, again, if you start to create, if you have steep slopes, you have unstable sediment, you have a lot of rain.
And there's a human impact here as well. Like there's been a ton of deforestation all across, well, most of human habitat, but forests slow water, they help water move into the ground, they secure soil and rock and prevent this kind of thing. Obviously landslides and mudslides do exist in nature without any human influence. But again, it's an issue where we've made these problems much more likely and much more damaging by deforestation, by building in these areas.
So you had a New York Times op-ed. Oh, sorry.
I just wanted to say, so 1 in every 15 acres in California had burned in recent years, and probably more now. We didn't, but the huge wildfires in the Sierras, we're going through a regime change in the forests, and it's had probably a huge impact on runoff because we're not having the vegetation there to slow runoff, and that may have been a factor in the Casumnas River flooding. Daniel Swain noted that the Caldor fire was in that catchment, and we're only being able to assess how those burn scars. The San Lorenzo River also peaked more quickly and had a larger peak than was projected, and there's some large burn scars in the San Lorenzo Valley and in the San Lorenzo River watershed. So it's
some of those
important to figure out how to slow the water, but the trees are drying out because of hotter, drier summers, and there's more evapotranspiration, and that's why the forest fire we're seeing these huge forest fires. So it's an incredible challenge for us to face.
Right, and you're talking about all of the compound risks, all those interlaced risks. Yes,
there is a factor too in helping groundwater to recharge to a much greater degree that can actually mitigate fire risk. And there's been some scientific work on beaver dams and the way in which they create kind of a fire break. But more broadly, when you have groundwater in reach of tree roots and other big plants, they're able to, they're much less desiccated, they're more well hydrated and less likely to burn. So healing our groundwater system and our groundwater surface water relationship can also play a role in dampening the size and the craziness of the fires that we've been experiencing.
And I'd love to hear from you, Erica. And by the way, Dustin, I know you were along the San Lorenzo River, so let's hear from you in a minute too. But Erica, let's go back to your New York Times piece, because you did describe how certainly in certain areas where the geology is right, where the sediment is right, you can take advantage of some of this water as well. Just restore these great reservoirs underground that could be harnessed here. But could you just describe that work?
Yeah. So, I mean, in California, we have a long history, not just in California, but especially in California, of thinking of groundwater as extra water that we can use when surface water runs low. But in fact, surface water and groundwater are linked by gravity and hydraulic pressure. So, if a groundwater system has a high water table, if it's full and healthy, it will supply wetlands, streams, and rivers from below when surface water is low. And this is, part of its relationship. We tend to think of streams in the West as only running, and there's like crazy rain and thunder happening right now. Anyway,
Interesting.
these streams
If I
historically
could add something though,
run year round.
About recent research about, so there were huge stream deficits, and what happens is the amount of water for recharge and runoff in California, in the Sierra Nevada, is just there's a big chunk of it that just isn't there. The percent of precipitation that is going into recharge and runoff of it's evaporating into the atmosphere. And there's recent research by Christine Albano et al. At the Desert Research Institute, and used reanalysis data to show that there's been a huge increase in evaporative thirst in the atmosphere. And that's why 1,000-year-old bristlecone pines are dying in the Sierras. It's because it's not just increased heat and increased temperatures, but also reduced humidity. And it's why we've had fires across the West, and it's probably why we've seen the same. There's probably something similar going on in Australia that's fueling the bushfires. So the kinds of groundwater recharge that Eric is talking about are going to be incredibly important, but we're going to just generally, in drier times when we're not in a really wet period like we are now, the landscape's going to dry out more because it's just hotter. And it's very hard on trees, and there was a huge amount of missing snow runoff in 2020 and 2021, and it's because there's a root zone deficit, that the ground just dried out and the trees sucked the moisture. Moisture actually goes into bedrock in the mountains, and there's recent research that shows the trees transpire a huge amount of water from bedrock. It's actually the same as the volume of all the reservoirs in Northern California. And that's a cycle. The atmosphere is pulling the water out of the trees, and the trees are pulling the water out of the root zone, and it's just drier, and we got less runoff.
What Lisa's saying is true, but there are, in fact, other studies that show that there is enough water in the state for these recharge projects going forward, even with climate change. And in fact, under some high emission scenarios, even more water available. So it is a question of timing and getting it where you want to go. But Andy, you had asked me about the New York Times piece. And that is focused on a geologic feature called Paleo Valleys, which a hydrogeologist at UC Davis has spent about 40 years studying. His name is Graham Fogg. And basically every major river and stream coming off the Sierra Nevada likely has one of these paleo valleys that was formed by the ice ages in the surface of the Central Valley, really just below the surface, like 1 to 2 meters. And these, the Ice Age rivers were really powerful, so they carved these deep canyons. And then that material later in the glacial cycle was filled with, rock and sand. So it's very, very porous, which is in contrast to the majority of the Central Valley, which is clay. And so water moves through that much more slowly. So the idea is that, when we have so many storms in a row and the ground becomes saturated, it can be hard to absorb water. But because these can absorb water so quickly, and then the water can move into the surrounding clays over a longer period of time, they represent an opportunity, according to Graham Fogg, to grab some of this water. And they are near a lot of rivers that are coming off of the Sierra today because they're the ancestors of those rivers. So, we may need a little more infrastructure pipes to get excess floodwaters atop these where then they could soak underground. But there could be a lot of local opportunity to take advantage of that as well.
What would be the policy? Hold on one second, Deirdre. What would be the policy path to re-engineering that? How is it?
Yeah, I mean, a big issue is land use. So one Paleo Valley has been found outside of Sacramento, but it's already been slated for housing developments. And it was slated a long time ago, and those developments haven't been built. But so far, local land managers in the area seem reluctant to let go of that plan, to use it instead for recharge. But I think, under the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, all of the local people in a watershed have to get together and plan how they're going to bring their groundwater area into kind of stasis so that they're not drawing down too much over time. And a lot of them want to do recharge so that they can continue to pump during dry seasons. And so, that could make local areas more likely to want to use a Paleo Valley for that purpose if they're lucky enough to have one in their area. I think also, it's possible the state could incentivize local governments, to sort of set this land aside for that, for the greater good. It remains to be seen how that might actually play out.
Hey, Dustin, I'd like to hear from you on this in the context of the wider sort of environmental studies, academia world. What's the role of academia in really kind of cutting through? There's so much information now. I was showing these maps, and the paleo work is there, and as Erica was saying, the logic is there for something like that particular intervention. But what is academia's role in kind of clarifying what do we do at the community scale?
Well, I guess to some extent, some researchers will be work with local governments or water agencies directly. I mean, to some extent, my role as an academic at San Jose State is to train future scientists and policymakers. So bringing attention to these issues, getting students to be aware of this, dissecting this, plethora of information they're getting from all sources and understanding what's the best path forward and giving them, because those people will get hired into these water agencies, which, sometimes those are folks who have been there for a while, right? And bringing in new ideas and new blood, I think, to those endeavors, I think is important.
Have you found, maybe, I don't know if I've done probably half a dozen episodes on climate doom, climate reactions, climate anxiety. California has so much of this sort of drama in its climate. Are students there, and given sort of the global rhetoric about there's no time, it's all our fault, what do we do? Are they energized, paralyzed? What's the campus like?
I feel like the students I work with are pretty energized. I mean, I try to present stuff in not that doom context when I'm working with the students, because they get that everywhere else. They get a lot of that. So my role is to, I think, show them what people are thinking about viable paths to solving some of these challenges. And so.
Actually, Erica, is your book on some reading lists yet in universities?
I bet. Oh, muted.
Oh, sorry.
Oops, forgot about that.
That's okay.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think I've spoken at some universities, including UC Santa Barbara in November, and I've been interviewed by various academics, and it's being considered for a freshman reading, like the book where everyone reads. So we'll see.
I will recommend it to the folks who are teaching in our sustainable water minor in environmental studies. So,
Thank you very much.
That sounds perfect. It's funny. I just noticed something on Twitter here that maybe I'll show. Yeah, I'm not sure if Deirdre's still on the phone, but Deirdre,
Yeah.
you and I talked about this, or we traded emails. And this relates to just like a holistic approach to both water and energy in California. I know I just saw that I wrote about this in passing last year when there was a proposal to cover a bunch of California's canal system with solar panels. There's a huge amount of energy that's required just to move water around California from and from other places to California. So how much of a is that? But that holistic approach is really hard. It's Erica, as you were just outlining alleys, it's something that in real estate, property law, hydrology, maybe first from Dustin on what, well, actually, Deirdre, if you're on.
Yeah, if I could just, I did want to respond a little bit to the thread that was there. So I actually am one of the big experts on climate modeling in the state. And I will tell you that there are serious issues with the climate models. Some of it is known biases. And based on my work, there is a state audit initiated by the legislature of the Department of Water Resources modeling of the snow runoff forecasts and the reason that they failed. But I did want to say that to people who know about the modeling, the forecasts about the water available for replenishment of groundwater overdraft seem overly rosy. And also, even the very best models aren't capturing nonlinear feedbacks, such as the extreme heat in the Northwest caused by 40% with soil moisture dryness. So
it's my understanding that those models aren't incorporating. Can I just ask you this?
So, hold on, Deirdre, hold on one second. Sorry.
It's my understanding that those models also don't really account for the role that vegetation plays in sustaining the water cycle, the kind of biotic pump. Can you speak to that?
Actually, there's a very good model that's developed by the U.S. Geological Survey called the Basin Characterization Model. And they spent a decade developing it. And we're advocating for better modeling to be used statewide. It also predicts the kind of vegetation shifts that we're going to see. But it's partly that model predicted a reduction in runoff in both the Sierra watersheds and in the Colorado River Basin watersheds due to climate change. And it has representations, a much more detailed and accurate representation of vegetation and ground and root zone interactions and so on than the climate models. So we're advocating that that be used statewide and that there be a partnership. But part of this is going to have to be demand management. And we can't be sugarcoating that, and we can't be waiting. We have to reduce demand in places like the San Joaquin Valley.
Yeah.
So working with nature is absolutely going to be the answer, but the other part of it is going to be bringing our demands into balance, and particularly with the new climate.
there's a lot there. I think in my reporting on climate change through these last 35 years, the models, there's a seductive quality to the global climate models. They're, we're integrating ever more biogeophysical characteristics into them. And but one of the early modelers, Suki Manabe, told me way back in 2001, beware too much complexity in your models, because they can look like the world, but we don't know that they're actually projecting what the world would do. He said we mistake qualitative realism for quantitative realism. And I'm showing this picture right now that it was the California Department of Water. It turns out it's kind of lucky that their drought had the reservoir levels low enough that they're capable of capturing, limiting flood risk, because there's volume ready to be accommodating some of the additional flows.
If I could speak to that just quickly. So there's supercomputer models that run global climate models multiple times, right. And it's called large ensemble models, and they run those, and they show an increase in both very dry and very wet extremes beyond the climate models that the Department of Water Resources is using. And researchers at academic centers and at have been using those models, and we need to use them in California, because the models we use underpredict the kind of very dry and very wet extremes we see. So I've been a huge advocate for using that kind of best available science. And it is extremely challenging, and there's a lot that we still don't know. But there's a lot we can do to also do a better job of really seeing where we're going to have these climate impacts, and it's going to be a huge challenge.
Okay, Erica.
I just want to that point, echo what Deirdre said earlier about demand and needing to constrain demand. There's a field called Sociohydrology that looks at the way in which humans impact water systems. And they've shown again and again that more supply leads to more demand. It's like when you have gridlock and you build more lanes on the freeway and it attracts more traffic. And so and when I say we have enough water in California, that's part of it. We do, we have enough, but we are not using it effectively in many cases. And people are pretty familiar with the statistic that 80% of human used water goes to agriculture in the state. Agriculture is actually 2 to 4% of California's economy, depending on how you count it. So it's not a major part of the economy. Growing food, of course, is really important, but a lot of what we grow is not for sustainability of California or even the United States. It's not just that it's for export. A lot of it is to make rich people richer. I mean, there are hedge fund managers who invest in California growers. And the big move to tree crops, almonds, pistachios, and whatnot, aside from their water footprint, I mean, it's hardened demand. They need the same water every year. And that type of crop doesn't make any sense in a state where, we have such water extremes, and we always have. And, there are many areas, acres that should be fallowed because people are reliant exclusively upon groundwater, and it's a dramatically overused resource. There are places that have turned to salt because people have irrigated them for so long. So, the move to recharge more groundwater is leading to people looking at rights to winter water, because a water right, California is kind of famously over allocated, but most of that water, people want it in the summer when they're trying to grow crops and there's no rain. So the winter water largely has not been allocated for water rights. And so now people are trying to kind of scramble to get access to that water so they can recharge, so they can continue to pump in the summer. I hope that might be an opportunity to overhaul California's water rights system more comprehensively. Other places have done that in recent years, Australia, Colorado, to varying degrees of success. But the idea that we need to be locked into something that was created 100, 150 years ago, when we have climate change, when we have ecosystem collapse, when we have a vastly larger population, it's kind of madness.
Mm-hmm.
So, Dustin, I'd love to hear from you too. And next steps for your region. The one thing that we were just talking about modeling, but we weren't talking about the paleo realities also. And you went back to 1955, the Lorenzo River flood, and you were showing comparison. But of course, the work of Lynn Ingram and Mike Bettinger and others goes back several thousand years.
Yep.
In which it's again clear that what we're looking at now in California is nowhere near a worst case for the intensity and sustained intensity of rainfall.
Yeah, it kind of goes. So you might argue that the Spanish settlers who came here were the first to experience that weather whiplash. They built a mission 2 years after the Portola expedition came up the coast in Santa Cruz. It was the 9th mission, I believe, or 12th mission, something like that. And they built it on rich soil so they can have gardens right outside of and guess what? The water came up right away. And that first mission got destroyed after 2 floods within the first 2 years, and they had to build it up higher. And they eventually was destroyed by an earthquake, but that's an aside. So we've had quite a long experience in this region with these 3 rivers, not just the San Lorenzo, but the Soquel and the Pajaro River, all of which flooded in this last event. I was looking back a little bit at the history there, just notes I've taken over the years. And in 1955 and 1982 are the big storms in the recent memory. 1955 is what got the city to build and commit to building a levee system. And that's where the Army Corps of Engineers came in. And because 1955 flood, there was houses floating down the river, as I showed on social media, and basically all of downtown flooded. If you looked at the footprint of that particular flooding event. And in the 1982 storm, the levees actually held in town, but there was a big mudslide that killed 22 people called the Love Creek slide. The big USGS reports on that. So, this river has been, and the Santa Cruz Mountains as a rain generator have been, literally buried in water many times over the years. You're going to a point earlier about the San Lorenzo's flows and the connections to fire. A large portion of the upper reaches of the Boulder Creek, which is a major upstream tributary to the San Lorenzo River, and then as well as Ben Lomond Mountain, which is the rainiest spot in the Santa Cruz Mountains, all were burned in the CZU complex. So the water came off of those hills, even though some of that vegetation's come back. Having a canopy is just a whole different level of hydraulics, and I'm not a hydrologist, but that's just me living in Ben Lomond in the Santa Cruz Mountains for a chunk of time in California and experiencing that incredible amount of water that they get up there. Interestingly, it was the 1940 floods in Santa Cruz that got the businesses upset with the situation, with the flooding situation. The city hired they sought out a technical report for how to design those levees, and it was supposed to come out in 1941, but there was another flood in 1941, so they had to go back and think about it again, and then they never built them again until that 1955 flood literally destroyed much of downtown. It destroyed the Chinatown that used to be on the banks of the river there. Auto dealerships used to be all along the river in Santa Cruz County. I'm sorry, on the San Lorenzo River in downtown Santa Cruz, and there were tires and car parts and all sorts of stuff all along the beaches after that particular episode. I bet you there's some cars probably out there under the water way out there. But
one thing I wanted to ask you, Erica, I'm not sure if you got into this in your book. How do you know? It's like with a mega drought, you really only know you're in one until you're 10 or 10 years into it. Like with this dynamics across the Pacific Ocean, there is that news that center at Scripps and other people who are studying predictability. But I wondered if any of you have your own sense of the literature on are we looking at what could end up being like an 1861, 1862 event? Or are there characteristics of these systems? I'm planning to get Dettinger and others on here for another webcast on this, but if you happen to have been
I
digging
was
into that
on,
question, I'd love to know.
I was
just
on
read
KQED
500
this.
research papers, so I actually have it.
Just hold on one second, Deirdre.
I was just going to say I was on KQED this morning with Michael Anderson, who's the state climatologist, and he said that the quantities of rain that we've gotten this time are among the top 3 highest years, and the highest being the 1861-62 flood.
And
Yeah,
snowpack is at I guess Sierra snowpack hit their annual total already, and the Southern Sierra is about to hit it. So we've gotten a tremendous amount of snow as well, which could pose problems later in the spring when things warm up. I think a major difference in our experience of those storms is in the 1907 floods. California 1907, 1908 floods is what I think prompted much of the water protection system on the San Joaquin River to be built, and that also flooded Santa Cruz, by the way. And if I could just add one more thing about the San Lorenzo River, I think it speaks to the slow water point. The 1940 was the first time they really started talking about putting flood control on the San Lorenzo River in a public dialogue. And the first thing that they did, actually, instead of building levees, was they removed a 6-acre island from the mouth of the San Lorenzo River that used to be there. That, in fact, that island contributed to the surf break that the Hawaiian princes who came to California and brought surfing to California, they actually surfed the mouth of the San Lorenzo River when it had an island in it, a 6-acre island back in the day. So slow water for sure.
Well,
So I have an answer if I could tell you. So there's recent research by Daniel Swain et al. That shows that there are families of atmospheric rivers. They did a pattern analysis and found different modes in the North Pacific that were associated with different patterns. This is not associated with the strongest pattern. The strongest pattern is during an El Nino year when you get a whole family, a sequence of back-to-back El Nino amplified storms. And we probably will have it coming because Mike Dettinger and Daniel Kayan published a paper in which they found that there's a peak about roughly every 10 to 17 years when we see a high number of landfalling ARs, and the research may point to that kind of family. What we have now, they're not Pineapple Express ARs, they're originate in the Western Pacific, and those are generally lower intensity, according they have different teleconnections. So that's why we've had a huge long family. We also have an unusually long Pacific jet extension, and there is at least one researcher who thinks that is likely due to but what's the warming in the Arctic and the unusual warming in the Bering Sea kind of juicing up this storm pattern. But there has been, a lot of energy in the cyclones that have been spinning off as well. So there are, if it's being affected by the Arctic warming, we may be seeing these unusually long extensions, a long series of storms more commonly than we did before.
Yeah, that work by Daniel
that would be
Swain
edge
has
research.
Yeah, I know. Swain has really been at the leading edge on that work. When I get back to the policy questions, though, it always here in the media, Erica and I, other journalists, we're always attracted to the new and the novel. And of course, as Dustin and other scientists know, the cutting edge of knowledge is always kind of a back and forth, tough process. There's negative learnings that happen sometimes, as Michael Oppenheimer and other scientists once published a paper on negative learning. Like hurricanes are way more complex to understand than they were when I did my 1988 global warming story, when basically the idea was warmer oceans mean more powerful hurricanes. And now it's way more complex than that. And so patterns, other things get in the way. And so the work of Dan Swain, anyone who's on that cutting edge of understanding the role of climate change in what could or is already happening, that's great and important work. But if we over focus on it, you end up with information whiplash, not just weather whiplash. I've talked about whiplash journalism, where we just go from, well, yes, the Arctic is connected, or maybe no, and you get these fights and people don't actually focus on what do you do. So that's why I'm attracted to that. I always circle back to that question. What do you do with the level of knowledge we have now, or that we might be able to accrue? There's the paleo knowledge, the work of Ingram and others digging into the past, super sobering. There's the work Deirdre was alluding to on climate modeling, showing these, the work that there could very well be patterns in these storms that just take us into new territory. And then there are communities, there's limited resources, there's intersectional questions. Who's most vulnerable? Who makes the decision about that are going to be really tough? But if California, I guess maybe the closing thought here from me, and I'd like to have your last reactions, is California is a great laboratory to look at if you're at any other part of the country or anywhere else in the world where you're grappling with managing both too little and too much water. California, including with all of its antiquated norms from 100 years ago, seems to be a very important place to look for the next steps. Erica, what's your takeaway on that? Knowing what we know about these systems now, and what's a good next step?
Yeah, in my book, I call California the apex of water engineering hubris. And I think, we really have pushed human use to the max here. And that unfortunately makes us much more vulnerable to these shifts between drought and flood. So yeah, I think it is perhaps accurate that a lot of things go wrong here. But I don't think that California is necessarily the path to follow. I mean, there are some adaptations that people are doing here, like the state now has levee setbacks, moving the levee back from the edge of the river as a part of its flood control policy. Like I said, that all of these groundwater sustainability agencies are focused more on recharge. There are a number of floodplain reconnection projects. So it's not all bad, but we've really played a large role in creating these problems for ourselves. So it would be great to think that California might be on the edge of turning that around and changing our relationship with water. But I think we do have a really ingrained control mindset here that's going to be difficult to overcome.
I couldn't agree more. It's tough, but maybe that's also part of the test bed question. Look there for what not to do as well as what to do, including when Bill Maher said, well, he said, just build a pipeline to take all that wet water from the east to the dry state. I don't think that's where we're going to head. Although actually Henry Miller and others were writing about this. It's actually in some discussions. Deirdre, if you're on, if you had a last thought, and then Dustin.
I did want to say that we've built in places, we built a huge number of levees in the Central Valley and other areas in the early 20th century. And we really have to grapple with what that means because right now we are expanding a bullseye. So I hope we can do that.
Oh, I love that term I use. I don't know how many times I've written expanding bullseye, drawing on the work of Steve Strader and Walker Ashley, two geographers who really turned it into a methodology. They show vividly in areas of risk that we're building a target. And again, you consider the storms to be like darts or arrows. Some are bigger, some are getting bigger. But if you're building a bigger target, that's a huge part of the problem. So Dustin, thank you, Deirdre, again, and good luck cleaning up the redwood branches that fell around your house and took down your internet and everything else. But Dustin,
I think that another storm's coming now, so I'm glad I'm getting this in before our power goes out. So, you know, California is has had to experiment to some extent with a lot of these things just out of necessity, and it's a big state. It's got a lot of sometimes it has a decent budget and that's able to, you know, reinvest in some of these projects. So that's really, I think, great. So what do we do now? You know, with the bomb cyclone and the coastal erosion that's happened, we got to start implementing our coastal adaptation plans and management plans. So many cities have them, but they really haven't done anything on them. Thinking about more in the groundwater issue in our county here. First of all, we get most of our drinking water from groundwater, so that's important. But in the South County, there's a ton of seawater intrusion. So, you know, supporting more projects like that, I think, is really critical. And often those projects aren't even coming from, sometimes it's state funded, but sometimes we need, you know, to attract some private investment in that as well. And then, you know, on the expanding bullseye question and, you know, places at risk from these storms, one thing that we really haven't talked about in this conversation is how many people in the Santa Cruz Mountains or in California in general have built homes on former landslides or next to landslides or below landslides or above landslides. And, you know, that's living with a pretty serious risk in an area that is prone to getting the volumes of water in these discrete amounts in very short time periods. So we're going to have to start thinking about how to manage how water's coming off of some of these mountains and make sure that, you know, the people who are living out there are, you know, able to do so before something like the Love Creek slide of 1982 happens there.
Well, we'll be doing more of these webcasts to dig in a little bit on some of those more fine-grained questions. And as I've done with wildfire and so many other threats that are at this interface of, well, risk is the hazard times exposure over vulnerability. And there's work to be done on all those. Slowing down global warming by cutting emissions of greenhouse gases is almost assuredly a good idea. If there are places where energy poverty is a particular challenge, then those places should get other considerations, obviously. But dealing with the exposure and vulnerability and doing it in an iterative way, knowing that we don't know everything and knowing that often we don't know most things about these big systems, learning and adjusting, reading books like Erica Guy's book is a good starting place. Having conversations like this, as long as we end up with a to-do list, is a useful and important thing as well. So thanks all for being here today. This was a brief Coast Reels Underwater Whiplash. And we'll be back with all of you, I'm sure, off and on. Dustin Mulvaney at San Jose State, Erica Guys, wonderful writer, with a book that I hope people are talking about and reading everywhere. Deirdre Desjardins, who's grappling with part of this disaster in her home in the mountains above Santa Cruz, and works as an independent analyst of California water systems. She's at Flowing Uphill on Twitter. Erica is EGIES on Twitter. Dustin is Dustin Mulvaney on Twitter. I'm glad you're all still there. It's a useful space despite Elon Musk's best efforts to kind of muck things up. And this can be shared after we're done. There's on LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter.
Thank you, Andy.
Thanks for being here. And,
yes, it was delightful to be with you all. Thank you.
And thank you, Deirdre, too. I think Deirdre's calling back. All right, take care.